The first tablets that George Smith translated was the Epic of Gilgamesh, discussing an ancient story with great heroes that rose up from bloodline kings to rule over the ancient city of Uruk. In these tablets, it doesn't just discuss how they created us based on something that could maintain the infrastructure here and only be a slave, but actually creator gods like them. He went to the underworld to be the god of the underworld. Later on, he was demonized by religion to be called Satan or Lucifer. And Adapa is described as being an ancient being that was able to be alive for hundreds and hundreds of years. And he's described in the myth of Adapa as not only being just a perfect man, but the greatest among the Anunnaki of all. If you are a being that can live for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, imagine the kind of knowledge you could amass. How far could you go in that time period? In order to understand our human origin story, we have to go back to the very beginning of the oldest tablets ever written. In order to understand that story, we have to know a little bit of history first. In 1849, the archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard discovered the ancient city of Nineveh in modern-day Iraq, in the area known as Mosul today. In that region, he uncovered the greatest library ever amassed in history, known as the Royal Ashurbanipal Library. In this library, he discovered over 30,000 cuneiform tablets, changing our entire understanding of history and pushing back our narrative by thousands of years. He uncovered famous ancient tablets such as the Atrahasis, Myth of Adapa, and Epic of Gilgamesh. When he discovered these tablets, at first nobody knew how to translate them, and hundreds of years of history was still unknown to them, as it was known as a dead language. The Sumerian civilization had written down incredible origin stories that were simply unknown because it was a language that had died out more than 1,000 years before. It wasn't until an archaeologist and historian named George Smith came along and pieced together this missing story of history, discovering that the ancient Sumerians had not only cataloged, but put together a history that predated our understanding by thousands of years in the past, before the events of the Younger Dryas 13,000 years ago, uncovering a story of humanity that started from a very different point than we're taught in school. The first tablets that George Smith translated was the Epic of Gilgamesh, discussing an ancient story with great heroes that rose up from bloodline kings to rule over the ancient city of Uruk. The story of Gilgamesh is taught in school, but it's taught to us as a myth, a legend that doesn't have accuracy and truth based on any actual locations. But when one actually looks into those tablets, they find that the cities mentioned there and the time periods actually match up with a time period that the Sumerians discuss and later the Akkadians in the ancient region of Iraq, where basically our story begins. In Iraq, in the ancient city of Nineveh, there was a great king and ruler known as Ashurbanipal, who instead of other kings and other rulers like we've been taught about throughout history, who just ruled through empire building and war, Ashurbanipal was a high priest who valued wisdom to the highest degree. During his time period, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, he discovered the importance of these cuneiform tablets and immediately recognized their significance. In his stories that he wrote down, describing them, he discussed how they were the most important evidence from history to understand the human origin story and what occurred long ago. And he wrote about how, even at his time period, they greatly predated him by thousands of years. So Ashurbanipal, recognizing the significance of these tablets, came together with his entire army, sending them to every quadrant of the Fertile Crescent. All these ancient cities that rose up to power and then were destroyed, crumbling down in the ruins. Ashurbanipal dug through these ruins and found up to 30,000 of these tablets, bringing them all back and creating the greatest library ever known to history. Amassing 30,000 cuneiform tablets and organized them based on categories, some being laws and rules from the different time periods, discussing agriculture and trade, others talking about human origin stories and these sky gods known as the Anunna or Anunnaki. In these tablets, Ashurbanipal realized that the entire story of humanity was kept. The reason why these cuneiform tablets are so significant is that they have the ability to record a message for thousands of years longer than paper records or writing on a cave wall. In fact, it's the only form of writing that enables a message to truly last more than 1,000 years. We must understand that if you were to write down a message on paper, it would only last 500 to 1,000 years, which makes it extremely difficult to be able to have one of these stories survive the test of time till today. And the Sumerians and the Akkadians and Babylonians were brilliant. They realized that this was the only way to take a message and have it not become eroded and destroyed. After great floods and catastrophes, and even war and conquering where entire armies would burn cities to the ground, these tablets would survive. In fact, after his death, the city of Nineveh was burned to the ground, and the library was lost for thousands of years. One of the amazing things was that because these cuneiform tablets were created into clay, the fires actually helped them preserve them better by baking these tablets. So that thousands of years later, when Austin Henry Layard rediscovered the library, many of these tablets were still remaining, although many of them were fragmented and broken and had to be carefully put back together. Unfortunately, we still did lose a lot of the information on these tablets as they fractured over time. And when you read these cuneiform tablets and the descriptions of what they stated, we have to have these gaps where we have to try to fill in, where part of the tablet would break off. And we have to try to understand when a sentence ends and we miss a whole chapter of a story. It makes it difficult to still understand what these stories represented in terms of the knowledge kept. But because there were 30,000 tablets, it still enabled us to have a big piece of this story remain. The most significant of these tablets in terms of understanding the human origin story remains with 3 particular tablets known as the Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, and the myth of Adapa. They describe something very different than we learn in history books, a story that goes back more than 13,000 years and perhaps up to 50,000 years, describing how humans were created like creator gods in the image of these sky gods known as the Anunna or Anunnaki. Now, the term Anunna was originally a Sumerian name, and Anunnaki was actually an Akkadian and Babylonian name, but they essentially mean the same thing. And they describe them as the gods who came down from heaven to earth. In these tablets, it doesn't just discuss how they created us based on something that could maintain the infrastructure here and only be a slave, but actually creator gods like them. And that's what makes our story so incredible, was that we're told in school that we're just like a simple evolved ape and nothing significant towards the world of the universe. But the way that these stories describe our origin stories are completely different than we're taught. In fact, my favorite tablet that describes the significance of who we are comes from the myth of Adapa. Now, the name Adapa can be equated to the biblical name of Adam or Adamu. Now, in these tablets, Adapa was described as living in the city of Eridu, which is fascinating because that city is the city mentioned in both the Sumerian king list and the Uruk list of kings and sages as being the first city ever created on Earth. And in Eridu, which is in southern Iraq near the Persian Gulf, near the confluence of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, a great civilization emerged, and it's described how it was a city that was built in honor of Enki, the great creator god of the Anunna. In that story, it discusses how Enki created us in perfection in their image, where we got the gifts of these gods infused within us and initially allowed us to live for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But that's what makes this so interesting, because we've gone down this road of falling so far to where we are now, where our mortality limits our lifespans to only about 120 years because of our telomeres. But it was very different back then. We had a completely different bloodline and these hidden gifts within us. And Adapa is described as being an ancient being that was able to be alive for hundreds and hundreds of years. And he's described in the myth of Adapa as not only being just a perfect man, but the greatest among the Anunnaki of all. Which is rather perplexing if you think about it, because it means that not only are we created in perfection, but we were created in a way where we were even greater than our creators. And that's where a lot of these challenges came in that we'll be discussing in some of these episodes. It really is where the point started, the moment began, where the conflict of our creation came up against these creator gods, and certain jealousies and things came into play. Our story is so incredible. Contained within these tablets is the entire understanding of who we really are that greatly differs from what we're taught now. That's what makes studying them so incredibly important, because it not only allows us to have a different understanding of who we are, but how far back our story goes and where it began. In some of these tablets discovered in the Ashurbanipal library was the greatest source of historical information in the world, giving us tablets such as the Sumerian king list, the Uruk list of kings and sages, and the information that was handed down to a high priest known as Berosus, who ruled for Marduk in Babylon as his high priest. And in these stories, in the Sumerian king list, Uruk list of kings and sages, and these king accounts from Berosus, we get information that comes together and agrees upon each other. And what is so important about that is that there's a lot of debate whether or not these tablets have been translated accurately, because the numbers that are presented in there for how long some of these kings ruled is just beyond our comprehension. Some of these kings are described as living and ruling for thousands of years. But what's so fascinating about that also, not only are the reigns important that carry over and agree in each one of these different sets of tablets and kings lists, but the cities they describe as being the 5 original pre-Diluvian cities match up in every single one of these tablets. And that's how we have to take this information and put it together and understand where the historical value is. But in order to do that, we have to first understand who the expert translators are for these tablets. That's where the most important part of this comes into play, because we can't just believe a message that's told to us. We have to know if it's accurate or not. So one of the things that I do as a researcher into these ancient stories is to look at who were the best experts that translated these tablets. And to me, they're the 3 best experts in the world. The most important aspect to understand for where the origins of these stories came from and how we can understand what they say comes from the translator known as George Smith, who is the first Assyriologist expert in the world to crack the Sumerian code. That's important because the Sumerian language, known as a language isolate, isn't shared by any other languages in the world. And George Smith took years studying the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations to finally crack a code, reading ancient stories carried down by first the Sumerians, then the Akkadians, and later the Babylonians, describing heroic journeys, ancient kingship being lowered from heaven, sky gods known as the Anunnaki or Anuna, and our human origin stories. Later on, George Smith's translations were verified by Samuel Kramer and then Stephanie Dalley, who came together with common translations that agreed with each other with remarkable accuracy. This is how we have to look at all of this information to know what's real and what's not. I must point out though, there are other translations that are not necessarily as accurate, so we have to be careful where we take these stories from. Some are familiar with Zecharia Sitchin's work, in which I did get started in this journey, and I do want to give him some credit for some of the translations he did. However, as I started looking into these and trying to understand myself what was real and what wasn't, I almost became obsessed with the story of the Anunnaki and our human origin. And so I went in and I basically looked at all the different translations that have been done, and I read them myself. And a lot of them didn't necessarily agree with everything that Zecharia Sitchin said. But I do want to give him credit for starting this entire conversation, because without his books, I don't think that we would have progressed to the point we're at now. But in order to understand that, I went a slightly different direction, focusing mostly on George Smith, Samuel Kramer, and Stephanie Dalley's translations. Those translations agree in a remarkable way, telling us a completely different story than we're taught in school. The most famous book that George Smith wrote was known as the Chaldean account of Genesis, and in that book, he described the most important of these tablets, providing translations, but also something that others did not. Unfortunately, a lot of this information that was kept in these cuneiform tablets was later discussed by academia in the later 1980s and 90s as being just myths and legends. However, George Smith, being in the late 1800s, 1875, when he first translated the Epic of Gilgamesh, he looked at these in a completely different lens. Back then, we didn't quite have the same control of this information we have now, which enabled us to have not only the greatest Assyriologist expert in the world translating them, but an opinion that wasn't based on anything other than his own studies. And one of the most remarkable things that he said, at the end of the Chaldean account of Genesis, he gives a summary of the entire collection of all the tablets from the Ashurbanipal library. And he said something that was incredibly profound, that truly changed my opinion and perspective about these sky gods. And what he said is essentially that when he looked at every tablet, the only conclusion he could come to was that he called these celestial beings who came backwards and forwards to Earth. Now, what does that mean? It's almost a bizarre thing to say, backwards and forwards to Earth. And the more I studied and thought about this, the more I realized that it must be talking about different time periods in Earth history. Why do we know that? We know that because of several important tablets known as the Enuma Elish and the 7 tablets of creation. They describe these events that occurred early in Earth's history. In those tablets, it describes the early creation story of Earth and the celestial bombardment of different planets and the original planet name of something that existed nearby or even for Earth, it's unknown, known as Tiamat, in which a great catastrophe occurred in that planet. What's remarkable about those stories, it describes how these Enuna gods, with the great hero known as Marduk leading them, somehow were involved in those planets and the creation of the planet of Earth and the involvement of whatever Tiamat was. That's the only trouble with this, is we don't really know if Tiamat was actually Earth or was a different planet that was destroyed to become Earth. Either way, what's fascinating about that is that it means that these Enuna gods were somehow involved in Earth history over 1 billion years ago. That's fascinating to discover, because it means that George Smith, in describing how they came backwards and forwards to time, means that they were here more than 1 billion years ago, somehow laying the seeds to create a planet with prolific life that would later have humans come to exist here, but then would disappear to history. For millions and millions of years, we had this time period where we had gigantic dinosaurs roaming the planet, and then they were destroyed by some kind of a cosmic event. And then later, the human creation story comes into play. But where were they in all that time? Millions of years went by and they were gone, and then all of a sudden they reappear again with the human origin story. I think that's what George Smith was talking about when he says that they came backwards and forwards to time. But the real question is, why would they have come backwards to do something long ago? I think it gets more complicated than just looking at it in a linear way. Imagine you are a set of creator gods who are tasked with creating a human species in perfection. But in order to do that, you have to have a planet that can sustain and support life here. Perhaps that wasn't possible unless they intervened somehow long before. It's interesting when you look at the idea that they're known as the ordainers of destinies and time lords. That's how it's described in these cuneiform tablets. That not only are they involved in our current story now and our human origin story, but somehow involved with Earth more than 1 billion years ago. And to me, that means that they're part of this entire story, and there's a certain probable future that needed to happen. That's fascinating to look at, because it means that these Enuna gods are far more than just extraterrestrials that came from some place in the universe. The more that I've studied what George Smith's translations state, and the more that I've looked at how these Enuna gods are described, I believe that they're far greater than we even know. They may be fractals of Source, creation itself, and somehow they're in charge with going out and creating, and then everything comes back to the very beginning, where it started. But that's where this war in heaven began, because some of these creator gods, these Enuna gods, broke certain rules, violating what's known as the boundaries of creation. And we see that in the Book of Enoch and the Book of the Giants, discussing how some of these Agigi gods or watchers descended down to Mount Hermon in the land of Canaan, and were involved with mating with human women and somehow giving rise to these gigantic beings known as the Nephilim. Now that's important to understand, because when we look at the Sumerian king list and the Uruk list of kings and sages, as well as the king list provided by Berosus from Babylon, we find these peculiar ages of how long these beings lived for. Now, what's interesting about that is that if you are a being that can live for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, imagine the kind of knowledge you could amass. How far could you go in that time period? How far could you ascend with your energy? And I think that's where this entire story comes into play with how we've fallen from grace and fallen to the current state we're in. Now, I have evidence to support that theory. It comes from my favorite set of tablets known as the Atrahasis. Now, in the Atrahasis, it tells us the story from the last king of the last pre-Diluvian, pre-flood, Younger Dryas cities, known as Shuruppak. The city of Shuruppak was ruled by a man named Ubaratutu, whose son was a bloodline ruler all the way up to connecting to Enki, who's known as Untandapishtim, or Zayasudra. And now this king went on to be the last ruler of the pre-Diluvian cities before they were all destroyed in a great catastrophe. And it's described how he left behind the greatest account of not only our human origin story, but the events of the flood, and later how humans became mortal. In those stories, Untandapishtim describes how Shuruppak was a marvelous city that existed along the banks of the Euphrates River, and after it was destroyed, in the Atrahasis, it describes how humans gained mortality, coming from a place where we used to exist and live for thousands of years in our lifetime, to only living 120 years as a max. Why did that happen? We know that's significant because there's a particular passage in the Atrahasis that has baffled researchers for hundreds of years, and it's something that I've pondered over and over and over again, and I think it links and connects the entire story. And what it says, there's a particular passage in the Atrahasis that states, "Enki, where you went, you were to undo the chain and set us free." Now, what chain are they talking about? Now, some have suggested that this is a DNA chain, a link to us, them tampering with our DNA to make us live less. Perhaps. But maybe it's something even deeper. Now, think about what it first says, Enki, where you went. Where did Enki go? When you look at these tablets, especially the legend of Etana, it describes how these Anunna gods that are not physical, they're mostly corporeal, but they can take physical form. They exist in a realm that's beyond our understanding. And it describes how Enki was told or even tricked in order to rule in what's known as the underworld. Now, if we were to look at Earth and the existence that we're in here, we exist in what's known as the third dimensional realm of reality. But there's so much more that exists around us. There's higher dimensions and lower dimensions, also considered densities, where information is more understood in a higher level the higher your dimensions go, and it's more about an awareness and an existence in a higher state. So Enki's described as becoming a ruler of the underworld, but not just a ruler, the positive being to rule the underworld. Now, if we understand the law of correspondence, these hermetic rules that go into describing how reality is governed, we have to understand that there's these rules, these constants, that fundamentally are part of the entire universe. Things like duality and polarity, but also this understanding of balance. Now, it's interesting because Enki supposedly is described as being the positive counterpoint to another Anunna god known as Nergal. Why is that important? Because Nergal is supposed to be the war god, and he's supposed to play this certain role of being this negative being that influences our reality. And if you do that, the only way to have balance is to have a positive counterpoint for that. That's the role that Enki assumed in the underworld, to play both a positive and a negative role alongside Nergal. Now, the reason that's important, let's get back to the phrase I mentioned, the Atrahasis. Where you went, you were to undo the chain and set us free. Gets right back to what I just mentioned. Where did he go? He went to the underworld to be the god of the underworld. Later on, he was demonized by religion to be called Satan or Lucifer. But it goes deeper. We must understand that he went in the underworld to be a god there to rule, but why? I think it gets into incarnation and human mortality. When we look at the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Mesopotamians, and most of these civilizations around the world, they had an obsession with the underworld. They would build tombs, and we look at the Osirian in Egypt. We find these massive sarcophagus that are just single stones with nothing inside them. There's no physical body present there. So then why were they created? Some of the theories are that this was a rejuvenation chamber, or simply a way to travel into the underworld and come back as an immortal being. But I think that's where the story gets really interesting. Because again, where you went, you were to undo the chain and set us free. I think that freedom has to do with how the Anunnaki gods, because they created us to toil in this world, okay? That's why the Atrahasis is so important, because it provides all these different pieces to understand both why we are created and the reasons why Enki went into the underworld and why that quote matters. Now, I want to explain that quote and then we can go backwards a little bit to understand the human origin story. If these gods are somehow related to our karma here, and somehow our creation in terms of their involvement then binds them to us, by setting them free, it means that we replace them and take up the role as the mortal beings of this realm. So when by Enki going into the underworld to set them free, I believe it had to do with establishing and creating an incarnation system here, which some would say has trapped us in this reality where we exist lifetime after lifetime, having to come back and do this over and over and over again. But here's the trick. By not allowing us to have a lifetime that can exist for thousands of years, it means that we can't accumulate enough knowledge to be able to ascend out of the incarnation system, essentially trapping us here. If we can only live 120 years, how much can we ascend in that time, especially with constant conflicts created here? Division to force us to exist in a reality where we're battling so many different things. How are we able to ascend like the ancients have talked about all around the world? Or if we're able to follow these set rules in this life where we can become balanced and reach these higher states, if we're able to reach a high enough state, we can break out of that incarnation cycle and we don't have to come back. But that's the trick. Can you do it in only 120 years? Most beings don't even live that long here. Most human beings, because of war and conflict, maybe they only live 10, 20, 30, 40 years and they die and they have to come back and do the same thing over and over again. And I think that's why war has been used as such a tactic to keep us locked here in this incarnation state, to cause us to come back over and over and over again and to fill this role in the reality for them so that they don't have to. And I think that's where this line comes into. The chain that was broken was the chain of them creating an incarnation system and trapping us here lifetime after lifetime. It's not that we can ascend. It's that it becomes incredibly difficult to do so. That way, when you have billions of beings here, they can fulfill that role and that energy here. And that these Anunnaki beings are free and they can exist in a non-corporeal, infinite manner. And I think that's what gets so fascinating. Now, I want to provide more evidence that backs that up. In the Atrahasis, it describes the story of why we were created. And I think that's important to understand how that line makes sense in terms of our incarnation and what our existence is. In the Atrahasis, it first describes how the Anunnaki beings just came here. It doesn't say where they came from. It doesn't say what star system, what dimension, or even what universe. I think it gets more and more complicated the more you look at it. All we know is it says they came here, and that there were a lower group of beings known as the Ajiji, who were a demi-like god just like them, but a lower status being. And it states that these Ajiji beings were basically like the Anunnaki, had to maintain the infrastructure here in this planet. They had to create temples in very sacred places. But also, it states that they had to clear the lifelines of the land. What are these lifelines referring to? When we look at the Fertile Crescent region, which is called that for a reason, thousands and thousands of years ago, it was a much more fertile region, where the Euphrates and Tigris rivers created an incredible area of abundance. Now, when they came here, those rivers became the basis for an entire civilization that started with agriculture. And that's what's so fascinating when you study the Sumerians and the Akkadians and Babylonians, because nearly everything in our reality came from them. Our understanding of astronomy, agriculture, animal husbandry, studying the stars, mathematics, oral traditions and writing. Everything came from those civilizations. But they don't state that they came up with it. They state that it was lowered from these Anunnaki beings, and that they established and created these original civilizations as cities, like I mentioned before, like Eridu, and then the last city known as Shuruppak. These original 5 pre-Diluvian cities like Lagash and Bad Tabira. These were the cities created in a very specific place, in a very specific manner, that was mirroring a constellation known as Eridanus, as above, so below. They were creating heaven on earth. And that was the purpose for why the Igigi were originally, in the story of the Atrahasis, building these sacred temples and cities in very specific locations. Now, I greatly disagree with the translations that Zechariah Sitchin states that we were created to mine gold. It doesn't state anywhere in the tablets that we were mining gold, but it does state that we were clearing river channels, and I think that's where some of the confusion comes in for like toiling and working. And it states that the Igigi had to clear these river channels in order to have agriculture to be able to sustain massive civilizations. Now, why would you need to do that? If you have rivers coming down from mountains into a drier region with less moisture, what happens is you get sediment accumulation in those rivers over time, and they become clogged. So you must clear the lifelines, the river channels, in order to allow that civilization to rise up. So that is exactly what they were doing. They were literally toiling to clear these river channels, to not only clear them for agriculture, they designed the rivers to exactly mirror the constellation of Eridanus. Now, what happened? Well, in the Atrahasis, it states that these Igigi revolted. They no longer wanted to toil in this physical reality because they considered themselves like the Anunnaki. They are non-corporeal gods, creator gods. So what they did is they decided to revolt in these tablets. They stormed basically this temple that Enlil was ruling over near Enki. He told them, we no longer want to do this work. And so Enki and Enlil had to get together to figure out a plan, because these Igigi demigods no longer wanted to rule this realm of reality. But why did they need to do that? Why must they fulfill that role? It's still largely unknown. But that's where this line, where you went, Enki, to undo the chain and set us free, comes into play. Because first, human beings were created in their image to toil and do all the work that the Igigi were doing. Building temples, clearing lifelines, the river channels, agriculture, all of these different things that go into the building blocks of a civilization. But there was a problem. As I stated, human beings were living too long. It caused us to gain too much knowledge over time. We didn't die. We were immortal to start. How did they do that? We don't know. Some theorize that they went in and tampered with our DNA, or that certain bloodlines were eradicated. But one thing's for certain. Human beings were never the same ever again, and we were only able to live a maximum of about 120 years. And so this enabled the entire plan that I mentioned. Where you went, you were to undo the chain and set us free, where we became stuck in an incarnation cycle here, where the challenge became, in this lifetime, the short lifetime we have, how far can you go? How much knowledge and wisdom can you learn in one lifetime? Can you ascend great enough to get out of this incarnation cycle and break this chain? Thanks for joining me on this episode of Mystery School of Truth. In the next episode, we're going to go into the ancient civilizations around the world, the megalithic structures they created, and the knowledge that was handed down from these sky gods to create incredible structures that were nearly lost to time.